Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history in 20-minute espresso shot episodes served with a dash of personality. I am Hazel Baker, CEO of London Guided Walks, providing private tours, treasure hunts and live London quizzes to Londoners and visitors alike. To accompany this podcast, we also have hundreds of London history-related blog posts for you to enjoy at londonguidedwalks.co.uk/blog. And now, on with the show. Many of you would have sampled the delights of Borough Market, and whilst walking back to London Bridge Station, perhaps you've walked down St Thomas Street, walked past the lovely old pub and seen the blue plaque to poet John Keats. But did you notice St Thomas's Church there? If you enter the church, there's a door on the left, narrow but inviting. Step through and you'll enter a very small, narrow, spiral staircase. And up you go, 52 steps holding onto the rope. And when you get to the top, you'll be in a shop. And that shop is to the old operating theatre museum and Herb Garret. It's one of the oldest surviving operating theatres. And it's in central London. So joining me today is Monica Walker, a marketing and events manager from the Operating Theatre Museum and Herb Garret, to tell us a little bit more.
Once you pass the front of house and or small specialty shop dedicated to the history of medicine, you are basically taking a step back in time. And that is something wonderful because you can go to many museums and just see the exhibitions in behind their glass cases and you know you are being led. But when you come to our space is our main exhibition. It has survived these strange garret, which is a very old word for attic. A lot of people don't understand what it means nowadays because we kind of lost it. But the garret is literally where the apothecaries of Old St Thomas's Hospital, which used to be here in London Bridge, used to dry and cure herbs. The actual attic was dry. It absorbed humidity. It was very high for vermin to actually reach it. So it was the perfect place to basically store herbs, to cure them, to dry them. And then when the apothecaries took them out of the attic into their workshop, they made medicines and they made excess medicines. So then they will bring them all the way back to the attic, all of the excess medicines, so they could have them there in storage until they were needed to be passed around the actual patients. So that was back in 1701. The attic was there on the last reconstruction, like the reconstruction of the hospital that took place right after the Great Fire of London. And of course, the finalizing touches were given in 1701. And it was wonderful because suddenly you had this amazing space, very open, these beautiful wooden beam ceilings. You know, they're rafters more than the ceilings, but many of the beams were reused from the previous church that had been there since the 13th century. Because that's when Old St Thomas's Hospital was basically founded on that site, even though the hospital dates a lot earlier than that, all the way to the 12th century. But where it stands now, where the church is, that basically was established there after the Great Fire of Southwark of 1215. So basically, that's where the new hospital was built back in the 13th century. And the beams are still, are still there, kind of like connecting the past of the hospital with today, which is wonderful, and the space as it stands right now. So like that was like the original like function. So when you enter into the space, you are confronted with this kind of like garret, these wooden beams, this beautiful space. There are windows, but they were not original. They were added later. But there's like the smell of herbs because we have a lot of actual herbs. It's a very tactile museum. You can touch the spices and the herbs. You can kind of like look into how things were organized in the past. It's more of a self-discovery space. There isn't a chronology where you can say, okay, this is where it begins back in the day, and this is where it actually ends. But that's not the way that the space is organized. It's quite immersive in a way. So there's a lot of medical equipment from the Georgian and Victorian period. There is a lot of apothecary bottles because obviously the apothecaries were a very important part of our space and our history because of the herb garret. And all of that section was just absolutely wonderful. And then, of course, you actually have the operating theater. Now, this is a bit of a treat because half of the people that come around, they kind of always ask, what is an operating theater doing in the attic of a church? But the thing is that the church was part of All St. Thomas's Hospital. They were built more or less at the same time, and it was integrated. So, like, the hospital was huge. I mean, just to give you some coordinates of like the length of the hospital, it went all the way from Borough High Street to the Shard. And then
Wow.
it went all the way from St. Thomas's Street to Tooley Street, which is like two streets on the other side, closer to the river. So it was like quite an extensive space. It was organized around three interconnected courtyards, and the buildings were like 3-story high. And this was the reconstruction of the 18th century, so a very big kind of like new hospital that was built at the time. And the thing is that the hospital was divided as well in sections for men and for women. So all of the men's wards were located closer to the Shard, and all of the women's wards were located closer to Borough Market. So literally, the third floor of the women's ward was wall to wall with the attic of St. Thomas's Church, and of course the Garret. So once you actually understand the physical aspect of that, which now it's more or less gone, except for the
Mm.
women's wards, the women's wards still exist. Completely, utterly, we are unable to connect the space, but it's still there for us to, say, okay, so you can still see it from outside, but that's pretty much it. But yeah, the idea basically was then that with advances that were made in how surgery was taught in the middle of the 18th century, there turned out to be like a need for a space where they could teach the new soon-to-be surgeons how to perform the surgical procedures by observation. So the
Yeah.
idea was that they needed a space where they could demonstrate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically that's how the operating theater came into being, because they just needed a space that will allow for about 100 students to be able to stand and watch these surgical procedures. And of course the best organization for that is like a theater where you have a hemicycle, you have stands, and you have a point in the center that everybody can see at the same time.
Yeah, and the wood shavings give me a little bit of goosebumps every time I see them. Really, the reminder of the reality of it all.
It's very hardcore because there are a couple of things that people don't know about our space. That when it was rediscovered in 1952, they basically had to do a couple of studies and kind of like a small archaeological dig to analyze some of the things that were underneath the operating theater itself. So they lifted the woods without damaging them. And also they need to put all the cables for the electricity because
Hmm.
they wanted to open up as a museum, and that happened in 1962. They needed to have some sort of electrical work put into place. So when they opened this up, there was sawdust between the floor, the floor that led into the church underneath it, and what they were doing basically was ensuring that the blood from the operations will not seep into the church downstairs. I mean, can you imagine
Wow.
if you are in the middle of mass and then suddenly behind you blood starts to fall out? I mean, this is a problem. I'm just saying, this is
Hmm.
horrifying. So what they did was basically to create a false floor. So they raised the floor and they placed a lot of sawdust between the actual floor and the raised wooden floor. And the problem with that's when they opened it, it was completely naturally congealed like cement from the blood that had fallen there. So they literally had to like remove it for sanitary reasons.
I'm gonna have nightmares.
I'm sorry. It's surgery in the pre anesthesia and pre antiseptic period. It is something to give you nightmares.
So this operating theatre was women only, wasn't it?
The men had their operating theaters in 1755, so they had no problems. They had a very well established operating theater on top of the building, closer to the yard, and it had been functioning already for over 50 years. Before, actually 70 years before the women had an operating theater. And of course, that's exactly when it happened in 1822, where they're like, you know what, we're having so many more women that are getting hurt that need to have an operation. Then we need to have a space where we can do this safely, and we are missing a teaching opportunity at the same time. So this is when the operating theater was constructed, because they realized that when they wanted to find a space for it, the women's ward was wall to wall to the herb garret, and so the only thing that they needed to do was to open up a passageway between the ward and the garret to create the hemicycle, to open up a skylight because having light was extremely important for it and for the operations. And then they opened up the windows in the garret because they transformed it into another ward, a smaller ward for the post operations, that they did. So they would just leave them there for a little while.
Sorry, so before the operating theatre, where were women operated on?
In the ward with the rest of the patients, they actually
With all the
left
sound effects.
with all the sound effects. I mean, they left three beds on one corner, and that's basically where they operated upon them. In terms of teaching, impossible. You can't fit that many people around a bed, inside of the ward, and then you have to deal with all of the other patients who are waiting to have some sort of an operation. To have to see and deal with this, and the emotional turmoil, and the pain, and listening to the screams, it would have been
Yeah.
absolutely horrendous, and of course the lack of hygiene in the space as well would have made
Mm-hmm.
it quite bad. I mean, again, we're talking 1822, and
Mm-hmm.
no anesthesia, no antiseptics. So yeah, it was a matter of how strong you were to survive the infections that you will get in a space such as that. The operating theater made things a little bit better, but it's still, because obviously the women did not have to be operated upon in front of the other women, so that were expecting
Yeah.
to be operated upon, but they had to be operated upon, in front of a lot of male students. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this was an issue because obviously women were not supposed to be naked in the space, and they never were. They literally would have been taken into the operating theater completely clothed. In
Mm-hmm.
some cases, they would have given them a blindfold before they got into the operating theater, because obviously if they can't see all of the men looking at them, but they also can't see when the knife is going to reach their member or whatever they're going to do to them at that
Mm-hmm.
point, then she can't flinch, she can't prepare, and therefore she will not be able to move either. There were only very few operations that were actually done in the space. So there were only three, and they were the same for men and for women. So these are the ones that they really know how to do. These are the ones that were needed to be done in an operating theater,
Mm-hmm.
and they will do the same to both sexes, no distinction whatsoever. So, well, except how they treat some of them, obviously. But first of all, they could actually do trepanations. So you get a head injury, and it's required for them to actually open up a hole in your skull to allow for the excess fluids to come out. They could do that with trepannings. We have some of those amazing treppanning kits in our collection, where they were actually able to do that. But they will do this in the operating theater. Then, of course, they could do lithotomies, which this is the removal of bladder stones. Now you
Mm-hmm.
have to think about this. Some of the bladder stones that they used to have were as big as a chicken egg.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was bad. And many of them were more common in men than in women. Like, men had the largest amount of bladder stones in the period. It has to do with the diet, with water, so many different reasons. But men were much more, prone to actually suffer from that
Mm-hmm.
than the women. But if women also had them, they could also operate upon them for the same reasons. But this was an operation that was most commonly done on men than on women. But this is the other operation that will take place in the operating theater. And then the last one, of course, amputations. Anything that had to be outside of the body that could be extirpated, cut off, then that's basically what they will be able to do. But that was it. There were no more surgical procedures that took place on those spaces. And sometimes people think that the reason why women didn't have access to these before was because they were women. And I think that that is a very, let's just say that that's not the right way of looking into it, because
Very
women did not.
simple answer, isn't it?
It's a simple answer, but it's the wrong answer. I mean, if you
Mm-hmm.
think about the time period, first of all, who are the patients? The patients are the working poor. You know, these are the patients in St. Thomas's Hospital. And guess what? The working poor that actually were treated at St. Thomas's had really, really hardcore jobs. Like especially the men, you know, they were farmers,
Mm-hmm.
miners, they work in the docks, they work as sailors, as soldiers, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
and they had like the largest amount of injuries that
Mm-hmm.
required these kind of operations. So they were like constantly using the services of the hospital because of all of these different elements. And of course, because they are the working poor, they gave up in a way their privacy in order for them to be treated by the best, kind of like surgeons that
Yeah, they wouldn't have been able to
there.
afford it if they're both. Yeah.
Exactly. So, they did have to pay a small fee, and usually the bosses, the masters of the apprentices and things like that will pay a small fee, and the rich will pay for the poor and things like that. So there was an
Mm-hmm.
economic kind of like factor to it, but still part of it had to do with the fact that the operations were basically quite public, because the students will be there learning how they were actually being done. Now, of
Mm-hmm.
course, this has to do with the men. What happens to the women? Women were basically not getting hurt that badly before. Their jobs were hard, but they were not like life threatening in many ways, like the ones that men had. It's just that in the early 19th century, you have the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and women started entering more into the workforce, like factories,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no health and safety measures.
No.
So actually, more women started getting really hurt because they
Mm-hmm.
got into accidents with heavy machinery. So we had this story of this lady who actually put her hand into one of this and it shredded her arm. So they had to
Oh,
bring her to St. Thomas's and they had to amputate her arm. And that was the only way that they could save her life, because there is
wow.
one thing that you can't actually put back together, and it's a compound fracture.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a regular fracture that doesn't break the skin, yeah, it will hurt. They can just kind of bone setters existed that they could try to put it back together. As you survive the infection, fine. You may have a limp or you may not have full use of your arms, but hey, you are still alive. It's all good, right? But if you have a compound
Yeah.
fracture, you are already dead.
Yeah.
The bones have a splinter. It has cut through the actual meat and skin of your body. It's an open
Mm-hmm.
wound. You can't put that back together, and so your chances are that wound will get infected. You will have septicemia or gangrene, and you will die a very slow and painful death. In 6 days, give or take. That's more or less the average. Um, and of course, the only way to actually survive that was to amputate. That was it. That was your best chance of survival. So you have on the one hand a slow and painful death because you're gonna die regardless. On the other hand, you can get your member amputated, whichever was injured, for a chance to live. And I always say this in every single one of my talks, never, ever, ever underestimate hope, because
Mm.
that space, as horrendous as it sounds, is a space of hope. People didn't go to the operating theater because they wanted to die. They went because they wanted.
I think that's a very good message to end on, given today's current situation. Thanks, Monica. If you've enjoyed this show and have found it useful, then please do leave a review on iTunes. It's quick to do and it would mean the world to me. I'll see you next week for our next episode, but if you can't wait that long, then check out our blog, which is full of interesting posts about London's history, all the way from the Romans to history being made today. And that's londonguidedwalks.co.uk/blog.